Hello, this presentation will give an overview of the International Course Module or ICM program. In 2015, from February 13th to February 22nd, I was part of a group of 10 students and 2 professors who went to Yangon for 7 days. This video will present my anthropological insights into that experience and what it says about the education system and similar projects in the education. I think it's good to ask, what is anthropology? What do I mean when I say that this video will have anthropological insights into the ICM program? Anthropology's aim is conventionally said to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar. So it's like holding an uncomfortable mirror up to ourselves to see how programs and experiences we take for granted are historically contingent, not inevitable, but also to see how other people's ways of living make sense and are no more strange or any less contingent than our own. So, as students, it's asking, what does the ICM program tell us about ourselves? Who experiences it? Who participates in it? What type of knowledge is the ICM program able to produce? What distinguishes an anthropological perspective is the use of ethnography, also known as participant observation, in addition to discourse analysis, looking at history, taking field notes, coding field notes, and reflecting on it. So what I mean is that I was taking notes on the entire experience, documenting our interactions, and now I'm trying to critically think about what my experiences were, what other students' experiences were, and to try to cast a program that we just take for granted as a part of our university, to see it differently and to see it in a new way. I'd like to begin with a screen cap from the Faculty of Arts and Science website that describes the ICM program. So as you can see, it says that it provides an opportunity for faculty and student to have intensive international experience in an undergraduate context, and that students are traveling to distant areas such as Asia, Africa, Latin America, to have the idea is to have a more hands-on study. So it's drawing on ideas that we take for granted in the university, the idea that hands-on education is good, on the idea of globalization in the academy, that this is an innovative type of programming. Things that aren't apparent in the website or about the ICM program in general is that it is fairly limited in scale and scope. Most students don't get to participate in an ICM, but it is held up as a model of what people within the university want education to be like, and attempts to bring more of this type of education into the university. So it's an idea, what you can see is to kind of like play off the idea of ivory tower. The ICM program is an attempt to try to bridge that and to show that the university is engaged with quote unquote the real world by having these types of programs that take students far from the university. So more about the students who took part in our ICM. That is a picture, by the way, of us all crossing after waiting for someone to arrive for an interview that we did. So most of the students on the ICM knew each other from being in the same program, and the idea and hope to go on an ICM was modeled to them by upper years who had also gone on an international course module programs. So what this meant in practice was that there was a high concentration of students who came from their course unions. They began to plan for it the year before. When planning, it was decided that 2 anthropologists would be included. One of them is myself. That's how I was brought into this program. It involves applications to the Faculty of Arts and Science. So these students applied to the faculty in May 2014. They were approved shortly thereafter in late May. The university has different requirements, specifically fundraisers, which we had to do because we had socially had to give gifts to people we interviewed, to be polite, to recognize the time they gave to us. Many of them were very busy. And so the fundraisers were to raise money for that. Wasn't included, though we found it was definitely an additional stress to the students, to say the least, to do that. We also had to coordinate sending in our visa applications, which we got the week before we had to go. Fortunately, it was very down to the wire on that. So in this ICM, the plan, yeah. So what did we do when we were in Burma? So again, we were only there for a week. So that really limited our time to know people, to understand the country, to have lived experience of how politics develop and what is normal or not normal, or normative or not normative in Burma. We did a lot of interviews, and that was the main way that we sought to go about producing knowledge. We did about 2 to 3 interviews a day. Most of them were through a close networks of contacts linked to the same person. We stayed in a hotel in Yangon. For food, you can see our Burmese assistant in the picture above. She's looking at the pile of cell phones that we had made, and she played a major role in helping us get food. We ate, generally speaking, fairly nice food. We by and large avoided street food. It was assumed that our digestive tracts were unable to process anything that was thrown our way, so we sought to have food that was a bit more expensive, hoping that it was more hygienic to avoid sickness, because that would be inconvenient, and also because as Westerners we had the money to afford nice food. And because of the difference in cost of living from Canada to Burma, what is an expensive meal for someone who is Burmese is not at all expensive to us. For transportation, we had a driver who took us between sites to get to interviews. It simplified having to, for example, figure out how to use transit in Yangon, which is made up of a lot of buses. It is cheap, but it would be much slower again, so we had the resources to do that. And connected to the network we were in, we were able to speak in English for all of our interviews. So even though we had a translator, it wasn't absolutely necessary in the interviews that we had, because the networks that our contact gave us access to were the class of people in Burma who spoke English. So language definitely plays a big role in ICMs, and our ICM is a great example of it, where they will send people to where they can communicate. And that doesn't mean necessarily a more typical person. It means someone who has either made themselves easy to communicate with, or through various means is easy to communicate with. So we had access to the English-speaking bubble of Yangon, not the Myanmar-speaking population to the same extent. Also, ideas of risk narrated our experience. So we, by and large, avoided protests. There was a march of students from Mandalay to Yangon while we were there, and we were concerned that that could prompt a security crackdown, and if they had reached Yangon, I know we definitely wouldn't be able to go there, even though we would have wanted to. So I chose the 2 pictures here just to show the different snapshots of our moments integrating into the country, or as we tried to. So for one, we were at a very nice restaurant. People had their phones out to check Wi-Fi, and eventually we figured that it wasn't socially appropriate, so we made a stack of all of them so no one could use their phone. And in the other one, we had visited an orphanage a short way outside of the city. It was the one time that we left the city of Yangon. and we had attempted to interact with the kids, but at the orphanage. But again, things like language mattered a lot because no one there spoke English. So that was actually the one interview where we absolutely depended on the translator to talk with the people there. And sports gave us a sense that we were more similar and that it was easy to communicate, but it was definitely a barrier in communication there. And I think that this is just more general of all ICM programs. So something that came out is really important to me when I was reflecting on the experience in my field notes was how the ICM program reflects the globalization of education. So in the sense that students demand global education, in the sense that students want to go to institutions that do try to connect with far-flung places, the idea that that is a somehow more inclusive and broad education. Not that it's a bad thing, but that's just what students are demanding, but also an idea in the education system, in the sense of the administrators, that education now ought to be like this, and education should bring students to these types of places, and that good education means creating programs like the ICM. And this is just a change in education that's made part by new technologies, the dropping cost of travel, and also connections between institutions, the internet allowing for more sharing and connections that might not otherwise have been possible, such as how even we were able to connect with our contacts here because of emails to an individual who had a broad list of contacts, which was much more easier than if we tried to do that through mail, for example. So this type of transition that is now happening, the forging of new linkages between universities and distant locations, and that being brought into the education system. Also, it reflects an idea of competition within the academy in two senses. That first, that U of T is competitive by offering the ICM program, that having this type of programming allows us to attract better students, people who are sensitive to the quality of education, or have more options, will choose U of T because it has this type of programming. They can have more broad types of education. Also in the sense of competition in the academy, in the sense that the competitive process is intended to ensure that deserving projects and deserving students get the opportunity to partake in this type of research. And also an idea of incentives in education, that students who put work into this type of program and who add time making contacts, researching, budgeting for this type of program will be able to enjoy it and learn as part of it. So these are the different types of changes that the ICM program shows about education today. One interesting dimension of the ICM program is who goes on these types of programs. So firstly, strong students go on these types of programs. So students from, and this does mean, by and large, in my experience talking to students who had middle and upper class backgrounds, who had the educational ability to do well in school, to be at the top of their class, such as myself, which is a byproduct of having grown up in a household where education was valued, where I was exposed to books early on, which other students who might not be doing well because they might not have had those opportunities are not as well positioned to benefit from in the modern education system. So I think it's important to have this in mind when thinking about this type of program and when thinking about it critically, that universities play a role in reproducing class hierarchies. And this type of programming, without having a strong equity focus, can help a lot of students who haven't. So who have the ability to travel and who have the education, advantage when they go to university, whereas students who might be struggling with school but also might learn a lot and be inspired a lot from this type of program have a harder time getting into it within at U of T. So I think this is something to be brought up. The program does try to challenge this, and this is worth mentioning, in that students who haven't gone on any programming by the Faculty of Arts and Sciences will be given more priority in choosing which students go. So students who have received other international funding from the faculty before aren't intended to receive it again. So it is intended to share educational resources in that sense. Though I think it is just important to note that there are enough students from middle and upper class backgrounds within the university system that this still means that a certain social location student generally gets to go on the trip, and generally in the international course module program. Other issues that are very related to class and understanding who is able to participate in this type of program, it has to do with small things that middle and upper class students have. So comfort traveling, having a passport, or having the CV and skill set to engage with professors and design a strong application, which could be more intimidating to students who don't have the social capital, to use that term, to easily talk to professors, or to easily the confidence to think that they could succeed if they tried to apply to this type of program. One thing that I personally found interesting is when I was wanting to include this in this very presentation, I was struck by how this is something I felt very uncomfortable talking about, that like even as a student we're raised to not think or to not speak about our own privilege and how privilege works within the academy. So by actually having to do this ethnographic reflection, I think it was good because it made me talk about these things, but it's also that is very unique to anthropology, and that's also something that a lot of students are not trained to do. However, that being said, there is a flip side that one of the professors did point out to me, that students who cannot do long exchanges can benefit from this type of exchange, and it is subsidized. So again, students who can't go on lengthy research experiences, or who might not have the money but who have worked well in school, are able to benefit from it. So it has there's different dimensions of it where it does help students who have privilege going into the university, but it also does have benefits that and dimensions that also help students who might not have been able to benefit from this type of opportunity. So there's definitely this tension in the program, and it's very hard to design a program in any way ever so that it's completely equitable. Yes. So another dimension of sending students on international experiences is how gender translates abroad, and how students learn to adapt their gender performance for international contexts. So broadly speaking, the gender composition of our group was 50-50 among the students, of people who presented as male and people who present as female. That being said, there was a notable difference in terms of who talked during our meetings and interviews with people. I took a tally during them, and I found that generally speaking, men talked and asked questions 70, so male students talked or asked questions 70 to 80% of the time. Students who presented as female talked or asked questions 20 to 30% of the time. And this was stable regardless of whether or not we were interviewing someone who presented as male or someone who presented as female. That being said, in one-on-one conversations with people in our group, and in small group conversations, male and female students talked about equal amounts. It was just that in a large group setting, people presented as female were much more quiet and asked fewer questions. So this says something about thinking about future ICMs, that large group interviews may experience this. I also noticed a different style and goal in the type of question that was being asked, where generally speaking, male students asked very political and specific questions with goals towards research. A lot of very just personal questions. Female students did ask more personal questions, which built rapport with the interviewer. So this was, I do not intend to stereotype here, but this was, so in terms of questions of personal questions, for example, such as asking a businesswoman um, what motivated her to start her business, which was asked, for example, by a female student, while male students in that specific interview focused on changes in law and how law and taxes, for example, had affected that businesswoman. Um, so that was a gendered pattern that I observed in the course of the interviews. Um, Another interesting part of this is that we, as students, we are also told and intend to present gender in a way that is not offensive, to be polite, to be respectful. So, for example, female students are told not to wear clothing that goes above their knees. That is said less explicitly to male students. And that we all police ourselves in certain ways. I had one funny moment before we left for an interview where I did an experiment on one of the professors by wearing a woman's laundry. A laundry is a type of clothing traditional that people wear in Burma. You can see it in the picture in the right top corner. The two women in the right side of the picture wearing the red and or wearing red and blue laundries. I had a black and pink one, and I was just wondering how long I could wear it before a specific professor would tell me to take it off, just because I knew I would be policed. And I was actually told very specifically, quickly, and firmly, the moment the professor told me, like, oh, you have something to change out of, right, in your bag. And I did, and it wasn't a problem. I just don't think the professor realized I was actually just experimenting on, like, how firm we were on policing gender. And it is interesting to just note as a comment that policing gender is a reality of how we engage in the ICM program at our university. So part of an ICM program is how do we socially construct research and understand it ourselves and explain to other people. So in the course of doing research, we represent Canada, and we experienced a lot of like culturally oriented questions, such as about how we looked. One minister was interested in where we came from ethnically. Um, and that's just part of the research process. In the course of explaining that we were researchers, we constructed a very interesting type of relationship where we had the freedom to ask questions about anything. So, for example, a lot of ethnic conflict is a difficult subject that many people in Burma are not necessarily eager to talk about, especially when it concerns conflict between Burmese people and the Rohingya minority. But by saying that we were researchers, we created just a type of back and forth where we were able to go into these topics. That being said, that type of relationship that allowed us to quickly go into these topics without knowing someone very well raises ethical questions and dimensions that I think students have to be aware of and that should be understood as part of the ICM program. So for one, and for this I say parachuting and researchers, which is what happens, but I'm actually drawing on activist theory, where international activist groups are often criticized for parachuting in activists. If they do it in such a way that doesn't build up local accountability and relationships with people on the ground. So, for example, in 350.org's People's Climate March in New York, there was some pushback by indigenous activists who were concerned that a large international NGO was just parachuting in a bunch of activists who didn't know people in New York, who weren't affected by, such as, for example, frontline communities by Hurricane Sandy. And I'm just like drawing this this comparison to in a way that like this is also what the ICM program is doing, is that we are parachuting in researchers who only have authority because of the credibility of our university. Um, and that similar to how international NGOs can be criticized for not focusing on building up local relationships with people on the ground, so that we can be accountable, and that so it can be fair to the people who are participating in the research process. Um, that it's really important for this to be ethical. We have to stress on focusing, building up local relationships, and even if it's focusing on having students try to add other students from Burma on Facebook, which is one thing that we had done, it it matters because it is purely a function of our privilege as people from the West that we can even parachute into other places and do research as though it was neutral, and we are singularly able to produce knowledge, and that understanding the quandaries of that, the ethical quandaries of that situation is really important, and that this is something that students might not necessarily be aware of, but that the ICM program should hopefully aspire to teach in students, is the importance of developing relationships with people and being serious and respectful for people and not seeing the people we do research on as objects. I also feel that there's something to be said that a part of the ICM program is that when we go to areas in the global south, we are going to have to come face to face with the intense privilege we have as Westerners, and that the ICM program, this is a suggestion I personally have, should maybe focus on engaging students and connecting students to long-term projects to support the people where we are doing research. There's a lot of colonial legacies where we do research, and it really benefits us to be able to participate in this program, and that for it to be, I think, ethical, there has to be a big focus on how do we benefit the people who are giving us their time, beyond just giving them gifts and listening to them, but also I think parachuting in students needs to be critically assessed, and that students have to really understand what's being done and really try to grapple with it and ask themselves how they can move their own research to a more participant driven type of research, to focus more on the goals of the people who are benefiting the researcher. So a part of the type of research and information experience we had was that we entered, and this commentary is totally based on a conversation with one of the professors, a bubble, in the sense that we entered the same social circuit, the same network, a very similar type of people, as seen in the fact that most of the people we interviewed spoke English or knew our common contact. So our point of entry immersed us into this specific social network. And we didn't recognize and eventually attempt to break beyond it. So, for example, one time, through another friend, not our main contact, we met up with a filmmaker, and they were much less prepared than other people for our interview, and were a bit more obviously bombarded by all the questions that we were asking them, and more confused by all of it. So a lot of our interviews went much more smoothly because people had a lot of advance notice about it. The time was set long in advance. They had an idea about what our interest was when we interviewed the filmmaker, for example. They found our interests. They very clearly struggled to try to understand what our main interest was. Many of us had different interests, so they would get questions from politics to what type of movies they made to what they thought of other filmmakers, which was interesting to watch. And I think an important point of this is that different classes in Burma are differently accessible. Upper and middle class Burmese people are definitely much more accessible to researchers, and their stories and voices are thus much more likely to dominate the type of research that gets done on the country because of that. So, for example, when we went to Yangon University, we met students and they all spoke English, and they spoke it very well. And we noticed after talking to them, and we hung out with them later on that evening, that they also were middle upper class. Like, they weren't typical Burmese people by any means, They had families that were able to give them opportunities to practice English. They had traveled to more places in Burma, and that is why they were where they were in the institution. So even though it was a public institution, um, this people who had more social capital definitely did better within it. We could see that in terms of who we were able to talk to. But that being said, I don't think that the idea of the bubble is just unique to our research project. I think this is something that generally happens when students use or participate in an ICM opportunity, which is that they are immersed in a specific network, and that's who they do research on. So I think um, it could be beneficial for the ICM program to recognize this and to focus on teaching students about this and seeing what that says about the type of research that they do and the type of knowledge they produce. And by that I mean that our project was focused on business people, was focused on people engaging with the political class, many people with the NGO class, not rural or agrarian Burmese people, and that is the majority of the population. So that type of tension and relationship is something to have in mind to understand the ICM program. One dimension that is especially worth focusing on is what the goals NGOs had when they met with us. We interviewed many non-governmental organizations. Um, so for one, they wanted to disseminate their perspective and interpretation of events. And by talking to us and hopefully having us write about their perspective or use their research, citing their research, sharing it back home, they sought to raise their international profile in that sense. There's also goals of public relations. So, for example, though the embassy is not an NGO, when we met with it, they wanted to take pictures of us to show that they were engaging with Canadians and helping Canadians access Burma. Um, there's also issues of status. So, for example, when we met students are not an NGO, but when we met students at Yangon University, they wanted to post pictures of them with us, and I personally interpreted it as a status thing of like, look, these are the type of people I associate with or hang out with, and they want their friends to see that, um, which was interesting to observe. Another goal that NGOs had when they met with us is they were able to experiment with the messaging of their positions. Many depend almost entirely on international funding, so as an international group, we were able to give them feedback. They were able to test out how different types of messaging made us react, interested us, or didn't interest us. One example is when we were talking to a peace building NGO, and they just totally tried out a workshop on it, seeing how, if we found it useful, if they were able to use it with other stakeholders to show off the type of services that they provide. In terms of the suggestions I have, and commentary on the ICM program. I think it's really important for future ICMs to understand the partiality of the knowledge that is produced. Again, we don't really have the time to develop local relationships with people. We're there for a short amount of time. We have the privilege of leaving in places that the people who we talk to, they're staying there. So I think understanding that type of partiality and to really stress that on students and to have them critically think about the limitations of their knowledge would make it a more educational experience for students. Again, I think that the program, if it could focus more on building up lasting relationships, so even, for example, when our program was trying to see if we could build up a relationship with Yangon University, maybe some form of exchange program would be possible. That type of accountability is really important to doing ethical research. And finally, I think that if ICMs are serious about equity of access, students' incomes and income backgrounds are really important to take into account to design in an equitable program that really shares the opportunities and resources that our university has. And it is important to understand that while this is a flagship program, that it is also something that most students don't get to participate in. And that in terms of enhancing education, it's important to have a major focus on the everyday conditions of educational life at the university. in terms of quality of teaching, how much teaching assistants are paid, ensuring everyone has a living wage at the university, that these types of flagship programs are great, but everyday education is still what matters and where students will process what they learn. And in conclusion, I would just like to thank the students who I shared this experience with, to the university for making the opportunity available, to the professors for going with us and putting time into us having this experience. Their tremendous generosity allowed this type of education to happen. It was phenomenal. Specifically to my fellow anthropologist, I used some of her pictures in this. Our conversations were very enriching. And finally, thank you to everybody who watched this video.